elaborate on that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with this. So Mach is first of all a community, or it's called a Mach Alliance, that has been founded in, I don't know, 3 years ago, and that has been founded by Composable commerce enthusiasts. I think Amplience and Commercetools were, and BigCommerce quickly joined after. In fact, Akeneo, Amplience, BigCommerce, and Commercetools are members of that alliance, and the idea is to explain, educate, guide the organizations on how to adopt, why to adopt Composable commerce. There is another element of that alliance that is to certify member. Why certify member? Because we want to avoid what happened with cloud. You remember with cloud, when it became a thing, everybody said magically, oh, my solution is cloud. And it became kind of a nightmare to identify what is true and not true. And so there is this process of certification to make sure that certain vendors align to those Mach principles. And so maybe John, would you mind explaining us what MACH stands for?
Microservices. Well, that's fine, but what does it actually mean? Why is it important? Well, the difference is, I guess, going back to this thing about the mobile phone and Compostable, microservices are the things that allow you to have Lego bricks, if you think of that way. It basically turns your APIs into smaller pieces, smaller Lego bricks, which are all independent, which means that you can then assemble them however you want to build your experience. Then you have the A stands for API first, and you can go, well, it's just the same, right? Microservices, API, same thing. Well, the way you need to think about it is, it's how you think about your platform. If you're API first, what you're really doing is you're looking at the business domain, you're looking at the things you're trying to solve, and you're looking at your system, and you're thinking about how can I build a system that is actually a set of services that can support that domain. And if you're API first, it means that nearly everything that you do in your platform will be a service. It's not like this thing over here has got some APIs and everything else you have to do through a UI. It's like everything is an API. And then the Cloud C, the cloud native bit, that's actually going to what you said earlier, that was a term cloud washing, where you had lots of older platforms would just turn up, throw them onto some cloud system and say, well, we're cloud. Or you'd have some open source software that would put some processes in place so that it's like CD processes that would automate instances and churn them out. And all of these kind of things say, oh, we're cloud. Well, what cloud native is when you build the system from the very beginning and you build it with the cloud services in mind so that it will automatically scale with the right cloud infrastructure. You don't have dedicated instances just for you. It'll be more multi-tenanted. It means you don't have to upgrade. There's usually only one version of the platform. Those kinds of things. And then headless, again, I have this a lot. People say, well, if you've got those other ones, what's headless? Isn't it not? It doesn't make any difference. So the normal term for headless is you take the presentation layer, you take it away and you replace it with an API and you think, well, that's easy to understand. Isn't that just the same? Well, actually, the difference about a true headless system is that it actually decouples the entire system away from your presentation layer. So you don't have to put things in your console, whether it's a CMS, whether it's an e-commerce platform, whether it's a PIM, the whole thing is decoupled. The way that it's structured means that you can build your business models, you can build how your business is going to work from that system without having to concern yourself about how it's going to be rendered in an app or a website or a voice implementation. Yeah.
In the same sentence that you're hearing Mach, you usually hear like best of breed, or I think we're supposed to say best of need now, and it's a fairly nebulous term, right? Because it's like, well, the needs vary like depending on individual setups, right? So I think if we're kind of looking at Composable as sort of a way to enable those next-gen experiences, then Mach really, from what you're describing, is kind of a set of tenets or principles of providing a guideline of what best of breed means in the market today.
That's exactly that.
And so when you are describing that to a customer or a prospect, and sometimes the first reaction we get when you are describing Composable commerce is, okay, it looks sophisticated and interesting, but it looks also complicated and probably very expensive. So is it more expensive? Is it actually more complicated to go after a composable commerce approach rather than an all-in-one?
Building e-commerce platforms in the old way, building things from CMSs in the old way. And the sort of premise is that you get this everything all in one box, and you just install it and it's just going to work, and then you don't have to do anything, it's easy. It is never that. You get it and you have to customize it. Because unless you want to be the same as everybody else, you're going to customize the platform, right? So now you've got this big implementation that is going to be a waterfall implementation, right? Not an iterative, incremental approach, because you've got to do it all in one because it's all in one. And while you're doing that, you notice there are gaps. You notice that there's things missing, the things that you want to do that are very specific in that customization. So what do? You then go and get your best-of-breed point solutions, and you plug those into the platform. Now you've got a customized platform fused together in the old way, with all of these point solutions glued in there, and you just finished the implementation, which, in my experience, when you do a big build, it's never as good as the one you had last time. It takes a few more iterations to get there. You've got it there, and then the vendor comes up with version 3.6.8 or whatever, and you're on version 2 because it took you that long to do it. Now you've got to upgrade it, and you've got to spend 3 or 4 months upgrading the entire thing. So I think when you look at complexity and you look at the cost, it actually isn't any more complex in totally. And it isn't any more cost. Now I think the question you should ask yourself is not about the cost. I think the question you should ask yourself is about the value. Like, does one have more value than the other? Are you spending your tech resources feeding and watering servers and upgrading? Or are you spending your tech resources differentiating the product and building the next generation user experience?
I think there is also maybe a transition period, because what you describe, if I try to also transpose it with my conversations with the market, is that when you reach that state of composable, so all your ecosystem is following composable commerce with Microservices, then you reach that state of fast time to market, cheaper to execute. You can basically do more things with less resources. But there is a transition period from the old way to the new way. And that, I think, can be complex or costly, because you eventually have a transition. And so maybe one thing I've seen from the field is that the most preferred way to go is step by step. We use a word in France in conversation, which is you undress the monolith. You remove one component out of it. For instance, you may start with PIM or search, for instance, delivered value in a few months, convince the skepticals, and then off to the next. And it's long, I mean, it's not a long journey, right? But you go more in an iterative way, and you have that change management element that is being considered, as opposed to a very radical, difficult, painful change.
I mean, obviously, like there are, I think in terms of setup costs, like obviously taking on these new solutions, there's going to be training, implementation costs, and so on. Yes, I think people have this idea that it's more expensive overall, but I think, as you said, John, you as well, Hubert, as sort of long term, you're going to see the ROI. Like, you can take that piece by piece approach. It doesn't have to be a full rip and replace like you have with other setups. But again, as you already touched on, there is that, what is the cost of doing nothing? And I think we definitely come across on the platform side sort of that sunken cost fallacy. Like, we'll be having conversations, and it's sort of, I've invested so much in my, the setup I've got now, I'm loath to just replace it. And it's not even meeting the needs of the business as it stands, let alone a couple of years down the line. So I think what we're all trying to do really as part of the Mach Alliance is shift that conversation from, how much is this going to cost me, to how is this going to help me make money and grow my business.
We have many different types of companies. We have retailers, manufacturers doing B2B or consumer products. We have companies that are pretty tech savvy, having some internal IT teams, some that are more dependent on and working with SIs. So maybe my next question for you is composable commerce a good fit for everyone?
So I think it depends, kind of, as we touched on in the previous question of, what is the maturity of the organization? Can they kind of take on this architectural change? I'm going to start with who I think is maybe not such a good fit. I mean, as much as I love the whole composable approach and sort of evangelize around it, I think for some brands it can be a little bit like taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So, you know, I'll have a conversation with sort of a prospective merchant, and, you know, they've got a limited set of buyer journeys, they've got a very simple purchase flow, they're not really selling cross-segment or sort of cross-brand, and they're like, oh, well, we're going to go headless, we're going to move to composable because that's the new thing now. And I'm just like, why? Why though? So I think it's sort of, you know, if you've got that kind of setup, you're not really going to reap the benefits of that composable architecture. So some of the things that I tend to listen out for in terms of a good fit is, you know, are they selling via a lot of different channels, or, you know, do you want to create very specific experiences for each of those channels? Is it a very sort of content and design-led brand? Are you selling via, you know, to a lot of different geographies or to a lot of different like segments or use cases? And that piece is actually very important. So it could be a B2C retailer who also wants to enhance their wholesale operations, and of course, very different buyer experience. And a nice use case actually for kind of that composable setup is wanting to experiment, that kind of speed to market and agility of, you know, if you want to launch new product lines or like test and learn in new markets, then this is actually a really, really nice setup. And an example of who I think is doing this really, really well and might be in the room today. So, you know, if you are, shout out to you, La Perla. So I think most of us know La Perla as a lingerie brand, but they actually have a very nice set of sort of skincare and cosmetics line as well. And previously that was all part of the main site, but what that setup has allowed them to do is launch a completely new set of storefronts that tailor the experience specifically around the beauty brand. And so I think for me that's a really nice example of a Mach approach, not just kind of enhancing existing experiences, but also fueling innovation and kind of allowing brands to tell that story in a completely different way.
Channels, because we've seen and we have clients, Danone, who sell through just one channel, and in their case, composable completely justifies. So just want to make sure that many channels is not a mandatory criteria to do composable. And to add, but for the rest, I completely agree.
I like a bit. That's good.
But industry-wise, I do not see this being restricted to an industry. We see composable commerce in insurance, travel, telco, automotive, B2B manufacturing, retail, CPG. There are use cases in composable commerce in all of these industries. And from the Mach Alliance perspective, we see also in terms of company sizes, we see startup beginning their business with a composable architecture. And obviously, very large group, multi-billion e-commerce organization on composable commerce as well. Gartner or Forrester did a survey recently that says the digital maturity is the criteria, is the parameter that you need to look for. And by that digital maturity, what they mean is, do you have the skills internally? And the skills doesn't mean you need to have 100 developers, you need to have at least one person that understand all the components and how they are going to work together. That could be a CTO, that could be a CPO, and that's it. And you can work with external agencies, you can have, I mean, we have clients at Commercetools that have 2 people in their IT team that operate the whole thing. But they need to understand API, they need to understand microservices, they need to have the industry maturity to embrace these things. And obviously, to conclude on that thing, they have the business imperative to be in control versus outsourcing everything to an all-in-one system that will do everything for themselves, and they want to focus on something else.
What you just said, because we are talking a lot about microservices, API, so all of those things are pretty technical stuff, right? So does it mean that the key stakeholder for composable commerce within an organization is the IT? Or do you have other key stakeholders, and how do you explain the value to them? Well, to people who are maybe less tech savvy, and that, yeah, microservices, sure, it's probably interesting, but I have no idea what it is actually.
Do you want to go first, Hubert? Because I think like we had this discussion before, and I think we kind of take a few different approaches. Otherwise, I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think for BigCommerce, kind of the messaging that we put out around Mach naturally resonates a little bit more with sort of the line of business and commercial buyers, sort of like heads of digital, heads of marketing, heads of e-commerce, because we talk a lot about sort of like those outcomes like time to market, increasing conversion, the channel strategy piece, which again, you know, like where it's relevant to those buyers. So I do think you always need the eyes of a senior technical stakeholder in that mix as well to make sure that that is the right tech stack for the business. But it's not always the path to start that conversation necessarily. Hubert, I don't know what your experience.
So
there.
with the new clients that embrace that Mach architecture, we've been more talking or approached by the office of the CIO or the CTO, and it's more at the beginning a technical conversation. Probably because they first look around and is there something different than a monolithic system, but also because they feel the pain of not delivering what the business needs. More and more we see the business coming in the table in the conversation and want to understand. And it's sometimes a challenge for us to explain those concepts without mentioning API or microservices, but showing it live in action. But
the inflection point in which you want to make a change, because ultimately the business should be making that change. They should be doing it because there's a reasoning to move, whether it's they need to be more agile, or they need to deliver to a new channel, or they need to do something for their customers. If you go from an IT sort of perspective, and it becomes a very technical discussion at the beginning, then you might lose some of the business value, right? Because like, we care about the APIs, we care about the implementation. And we'd be, it was great, it's like millions of APIs there, and look at all that JSON, right? That's what we care about. Whereas ultimately, it has to be done for a business reason, right? And that's, I think, to have a successful implementation, it has to have buy-in of both. Because if you have got a business person who's sponsoring it and driving it through and is going to do some massive change to the business, and you don't have the right technologists, dealing with it, then I think you kind of need both, but I think ultimately it is an inflection point in the business.
I think the challenge for us from the technology side is sometimes within a business you kind of have that buy-in from both sides. Everybody agrees on what should be doing. That's obviously not always the case. So I think what we are all sort of trying to tie together is that joint story that sits in the middle. Like, what is that kind of that proposition that meets the needs of all the stakeholders within the business, and how to articulate that through the Mach story.
But the transition from your all-in-one monolithic system now to a perfect state of composable commerce following the Mach principles is a journey, and the preferred journey is to go feature per feature or step by step. And PIM is a great place to start. It delivers incredible value. It's often quite fast to implement. And it's not just PIM, there's also search. We see often as a starting point. We see also often the experience layer, for instance, the mobile app or the front end that is being done outside of the monolith. And to come back to PIM, this is typically a great way to also educate internally why Composable makes sense to us, introduce the concept maybe of APIs, and start to move the organization towards those components things. That's my opinion, but maybe you have different.
Completely unsexy, unromantic view, of course, is that that product data is going to flow through a lot of different systems in this setup, and of course making sure it's well structured, it's accurate, is a huge value add. But I think there's so much more to the PIM story within Mach. And I mean, we've been talking a lot about sort of customer experiences, moving to that next generation of experiences. And to paraphrase Akeneo, you can't really have a good customer experience without first having a compelling product experience. And we see all these brands, regardless of size, moving away from that kind of race to the bottom on price and focusing more on sort of creating value. And product and service have to shine as part of that. And a lot of brands they will launch their sites on, they think the product is going to sell itself, and they completely underestimate the power of the buyer. Consumers are smart, they know the value of product. So presenting and showcasing that product in a way that it's going to be compelling to those buyers regardless of where they're approaching from, channel, device, country, is absolutely critical to making this approach work. So I see that's why I see playing into that story.
I think the customer journey is completely changing. I think that we've been building e-commerce sites the same way for 20 years. And it's been based on a model of frictionless commerce, the ability to land on a landing page, get people quickly through to find a product, end up on a product details page, and convert them. That's what we've been building for a long time. And I think that that's kind of changing. I think that's generational, and in terms of digital media, people are spending more time on social media than ever before. People are finding products not by going onto a website and searching for it because, oh, you know what, I need a lawnmower. They're going on to YouTube and watching things like, what's the best products I need for mowing my lawn? Or going on to Instagram and searching sort of influencers or Pinterest. There's a whole set of social media out there that's driving people into a customer journey that is not the same as it was before. And often the place that they land is in the product details page, which fundamentally is about the product. And I think what's really really exciting is that you're going into this product details page, which should be a product experience. You've got composable architecture, so composable commerce. So you can bring your content, you can bring all the transaction elements, and you can bring all of your data and all the things you need from your PIM, and govern it and tune it and tailor it inside your product details page, inside that product experience, as opposed to just this hard-coded product details pages we've just seen for like a decade, which is like set in stone. And then I bet there's many of you out there right now with e-commerce platforms go, I'd love to change the PDP, but it's really hard because everything's baked in. I think that's where the exciting bit is. You've got this composable commerce. Part of that is PIM, part of that is the e-commerce platform, part of that is CMS, and all of the other pieces that you need. And you can pull them together into an experience that the customer wants, not what you think they should have.
I'm sold. So I want to start my composable commerce journey. Where should I start? What are the first steps to start this composable journey? Composable commerce journey.
So the first step is please do not do an RFP with 600 line of features, because this is not going to work. One typical way to start is the evaluation is evolving, and those systems that we represent, those Mach Alliance certified systems, are very easy to evaluate in a POC fashion. So instead of doing those RFP with thousands of lines, take a trial account of one of our systems and just experience it. And in 2 weeks, you will have learned a lot more than just reading yes or no, I can do it. So that's maybe one first step. The next also thing is, you mentioned replatforming, right? You should also realize that you should never do ever again in your entire career a replatforming again. And that's what composable commerce allows you to do, is you remove the pain ever to have to replatform. You have components that are easy to move, replace, change. And so that may be your first decision to do no more replatforming.
I could not agree more on the 600-line RFP, mostly because I don't think it's going to necessarily, for a buyer, give them what they want. Because, if for us, as a company, if we're just receiving this with no context, we don't know what outcomes the business is aiming for. We don't know, what is going to meet their needs. So, it's much better to, as you say, sort of like, set up a trial, get a feel for the experience, speak to someone, or speak to some of the partners, get their ideas, speak to your agency if you are working with one, and work backwards. As I say, it has to be outcomes driven. So look at kind of the deficiencies of the current platform. You don't want to be moving again, ideally, and look at what you want to achieve and work backwards from there. Look at the field a little bit and see what's going to work for you.
If I was to say the first steps based on those things, would be to first of all decide which area that's giving you the most pain, or which area that you want to change, which area that is really important, and then build a multidisciplinary team. Don't just give it to a bunch of developers and say, can you just try this out and see if it works? Because they'll say, yeah, it works, and it won't be delivering what you want. You need a multidisciplinary team. It's very different. You have to be product-based, not project-based. Put a business owner in there, put some business domain experts in there, and your developers, and your testers, and your UX guys, and get them to try out and change the thing you want to change on your platform with whichever vendor it is in the Mac Alliance, and do it that way. And then you'll really know what the success is going to be, and not just it ticked the boxes because tech guys thought the APIs were really cool. Or actually, it is amazing, I can do all these things in the UI, but the tech guys are going, but it doesn't really integrate well. Do you know what I mean? So I think that, for me, that's what it is. Build a team that's multidisciplinary and choose the area that you want to go for and throw them at it.